There are moments in history when empires collide with individuals, and against all logic, the individual wins, not through armies or wealth, but through something more fundamental, something that makes you question what power actually means. In the American Southwest, during the 1800s, an Apache warrior named Nana orchestrated military victories so improbable that modern special forces still study them today. 8 warriors, 1,400 soldiers pursuing them. 75 days that humiliated an empire. But to understand how an 80-year-old man with a broken foot accomplished the impossible, we need to go back to the beginning, to a world where survival itself was an act of warfare, where boys became legends by learning to think like lightning and strike like thunder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the year 1800, as Spanish missions crumbled across the Southwest and American explorers had just begun probing westward, a child was born into the Warm Springs Apache who would one day make the United States Army look like fumbling children. They called him Nana, though his full name, Castziden, meant broken foot, a prophecy, as it turned out, both literal and deeply ironic. Think about that for a moment. Your name predicts your greatest physical weakness, yet somehow that weakness becomes irrelevant to your legacy. The boy grew up in a world that would break most modern humans within a week. Apache warriors could run 70 miles without stopping. Let that sink in. Not march. Run. Teenage boys proved themselves by raiding Mexican settlements 400 miles from home. 400 miles. That's roughly the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Imagine a 16-year-old boy running and riding that distance, stealing horses from armed settlements, and making it home alive. That was the entrance exam to Apache manhood. Young Nana learned from the greatest Apache teacher of all, Mangas Coloradas, the 6'4" giant whose very name made Mexican soldiers cross themselves. Imagine the presence required to terrorize professional soldiers through reputation alone. Under this legendary chief, Nana discovered what I call the ancient arithmetic of Apache warfare. Strike where the enemy is absent. Vanish where he is strong. Make one warrior seem like 10, and 10 seem like ghosts. The Apache didn't just fight differently, they thought differently. This is crucial to understanding everything that comes later. Where American soldiers saw empty wasteland, worthless desert, Apache saw a network of hidden springs, secret caves, and trails invisible to outsider eyes. Where Mexicans saw random violence, senseless raids, Apache conducted carefully orchestrated economic warfare. They raided for horses, cattle, and goods that sustained their entire civilization. This wasn't savagery. It was sophisticated military economic strategy that would make modern business schools take notes. By his 40th year, Nana had earned something more valuable than any military rank. He possessed what the Apache called power. Now, we can debate whether this was supernatural ability or decades of accumulated wisdom presented in mystical terms. But here's what matters. Witnesses, both Apache and enemy, swore they saw bullets pass through him without harm. They watched him predict enemy movements days in advance. They observed him finding water where none should exist. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the practical effect was identical. His enemies feared him as something beyond human. His people trusted him as something touched by the divine. That psychological advantage, that reputation, made him Mangas Coloradas's most trusted lieutenant. Together, they perfected what I consider one of the most brilliant geopolitical strategies in North American history. They played a three-way game between Spanish, Mexican, and American forces, selling stolen Mexican horses to Americans, stolen American cattle to Mexicans, keeping all three enemies too busy fighting Apache to fight each other effectively. Think about the intelligence required. You need to understand 3 different governments, 3 different military systems, 3 different economies. You need to know who wants what, who hates whom more, and how to exploit those relationships. And you're doing this while most of your people can't read or write in any of those languages. The sophistication here rivals anything happening in European diplomacy at the same time. Then came January 1863, the moment that changed everything, the moment that transformed Nana from lieutenant to legend, from negotiator to implacable enemy. American soldiers invited Mangas Coloradas to peace talks under a white flag. A white flag. The universal symbol of truce, of safe passage, of civilized behavior. That night, those same soldiers heated bayonets in the fire, red-hot metal, and they pressed them against the chief's feet and legs, torturing him, for sport, not for information, not for strategic advantage, for entertainment. When Mangas Coloradas protested, they shot him dead. Then they cut off his head, decapitated a man who came to them under truce. They boiled his skull to send to a phrenologist in the East. Some scientist wanted to measure the skull of a savage to prove theories about racial inferiority. Nana watched his mentor's betrayal and murder from afar, powerless to intervene. Imagine that moment. You're 53 years old. The man who taught you everything, who trusted you above all others, is being tortured and murdered while you can do nothing. In that moment, the entire calculation changes. For decades, Nana had been willing to negotiate, to find accommodation, to play the diplomatic game. That moment murdered more than Mangas Coloradas. It murdered any possibility of peace. The Americans had just created their own worst nightmare. An Apache chief who possessed decades of military wisdom, who commanded supernatural respect among his people, and who would never, ever again believe American promises. Not for land, not for food, not for peace, never again. The torture of Mangas Coloradas lit a fuse that would burn for the next 33 years. Because Nana wouldn't just fight back. He would teach the United States Army lessons about warfare that would echo through military academies for generations. He would prove that wisdom could defeat numbers, that knowledge of land could overcome superior weapons, that 8 determined men could humble an empire. But that story, that impossible story, requires understanding just how desperate things would become before Nana made his legendary stand. For the next 17 years, Nana fought alongside his brother-in-law Victorio in wars that turned the Southwest into a charnel house. And I use that term deliberately. A charnel house, a place of mass death. Because what happened to the Apache between 1863 and 1880 wasn't just warfare, it was demographic catastrophe. The Apache had once numbered 15,000 across their territories. 15,000 people spread across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, and Mexico. By 1870, just 7 years after the murder of Mangas Coloradas, disease, bullets, and starvation had reduced them to fewer than 3,000. Think about that mathematical horror. In one generation, 80% of an entire people gone. Not scattered, not relocated, gone, dead. Of those 3,000 survivors, most were confined to reservations, trapped on land they didn't choose, dependent on government beef that arrived sporadically, if at all, watching their children forget how to be Apache. Nana and Victorio led the few hundred who refused surrender, a few hundred against 2 nations. They conducted a running battle across 5,000 square miles. That's an area roughly the size of Connecticut. Imagine trying to police Connecticut with troops designed for conventional warfare, while your enemy knows every rock, every water source, every escape route. They weren't just fighting for land anymore. That calculation had shifted. They fought for the right to exist as Apache rather than tamed reservation Indians, the right to hunt instead of beg, the right to raise their children in the old ways, the right to die free if they couldn't live free. The Apache developed intelligence networks that would impress modern spy agencies. Seriously. CIA officers would study this operation and take notes. Apache women on reservations passed information through traders. They'd mention casually which units were moving where, which officers were planning what operations. Mexican peasants who hated their own government more than Apache raiders provided supplies. Enemy of my enemy logic playing out in real time. Some American civilians secretly traded ammunition for stolen horses, not because they loved Apache, because they loved profit. And Nana personally cultivated informants among the 9th Cavalry's Apache scouts. Think about that audacity. The army hired Apache to track Apache, and Nana turned some of them into double agents. He learned army movements sometimes before official orders arrived at their destinations. His warriors could read telegraph wires by touching them. Now, they couldn't decode the messages. They didn't understand Morse code. But they could feel the electrical pulses and know when messages were being sent. That's the level of adaptation we're talking about. Taking 19th century technology and finding a way to extract intelligence from it using nothing but tactile sensitivity. They knew that rapid-fire telegraph activity meant troop movements were being coordinated. That's actionable intelligence gathered with bare hands. By 1879, Nana was approaching 80 years old. 80. His left foot permanently twisted from an old wound. The broken foot his name predicted. He required help to mount his horse. Couldn't do it alone anymore. Rheumatism racked his joints so badly that some mornings he couldn't close his fingers around his rifle. His hands wouldn't work. Yet Mexican and American troops feared him more than warriors a quarter his age, more than young men in their physical prime. Why? Because he had become mythic. Soldiers swore he could appear in two places simultaneously, that he commanded wind and weather, that killing him was impossible because bullets turned to dust before reaching him. Now, we can analyze these claims rationally. We can say fear creates legends. But here's what matters for understanding Nana's effectiveness. The Apache carefully cultivated these legends. They knew that frightened enemies made poor fighters. A soldier who believes he's fighting a supernatural being makes mistakes. Hesitates. Second guesses. That psychological warfare multiplied Nana's actual combat effectiveness. October 1880 brought catastrophe. Tres Castillos in Mexico, a place name that still echoes in Apache memory like a scream. Mexican forces under Colonel Joaquin Terrazas ambushed Victorio's camp at dawn. Dawn raids, the universal nightmare of guerrilla forces everywhere. 78 Apache died in the fighting, 78, including Victorio. Most of the warriors. The Mexicans captured 68 women and children. Captured. Not rescued. Not detained. Captured to sell as slaves. This was still happening in 1880. While Europe talked about civilization and progress, Mexican forces were selling Apache children into slavery. Nana had been raiding elsewhere with 30 followers, 30 men conducting operations while the main camp rested. He arrived 2 days later. Imagine that approach. You're riding toward your camp, your family, your people, and you see buzzards, circling, dozens of them, hundreds. You know before you arrive what you're going to find. Among the dead lay members of his own family, daughters, grandchildren, lifelong friends, bodies mutilated. The Mexicans had celebrated their victory by desecrating the dead. The survivors who escaped to him brought devastating news. Of perhaps 400 free Apache remaining across all the scattered bands, fewer than 40 were warriors. 40, fighting men. Against the combined military forces of two nations, the conventional war was over. Any rational analysis would conclude that Apache resistance had ended. Time to surrender. Time to accept reservation life. Time to acknowledge that continuing meant only more death, more suffering, more children sold into slavery. This is the moment where most resistance movements collapse, when the mathematics become impossible, when hope itself seems like delusion. Military historians studying this period expected Nana to lead his survivors onto the reservation, the smart play, the survivable play, the only logical play. But here's what those historians didn't understand about Nana. Logic and survival weren't his primary calculations anymore. He had watched his mentor tortured under a flag of truce. He had seen his people reduced from 15,000 to a few hundred. He had arrived at Tres Castillos to find his family dead among the buzzards. At some point, the equation changes. At some point, resistance becomes its own justification, not because it will win in any conventional sense, but because surrender means accepting that everything you are, everything your people are, was meaningless, that you can be erased, and the world will simply move on. 9 months after Tres Castillos, in July 1881, Nana called together the last free Apache warriors in the San Mateo Mountains of New Mexico. He was 81 years old, crippled, leading 40 fighters against 1,400 soldiers. The smart move was surrender. The survivable move was surrender. Instead, Nana was about to teach the United States Army that sometimes the mathematics of warfare include variables that don't appear in any textbook, variables like rage, like dignity, like the refusal to quietly disappear. He was about to demonstrate that 8 men who understand these variables can accomplish the impossible. 15 men answered Nana's call in the San Mateo Mountains. 15 warriors willing to follow an 81-year-old crippled chief on what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. But Nana selected only 8. Only 8. He chose each man for specific skills, building what we might today call a special operations team. Caitane, young and ambitious, could track a snake across solid rock. And I mean that literally. He could identify the faint disturbance a snake made sliding across stone that other trackers couldn't detect. Old Sanchez knew every water source between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. Every single one. Hidden springs that didn't appear on any map. Seasonal seeps that only flowed after specific weather patterns. One warrior possessed night vision so acute he could guide horses through complete darkness. No moon, no stars. Just his eyes and the landscape he'd memorized. Another could imitate any bird call so perfectly that actual birds answered. Useful for signaling without alerting enemies that humans were communicating. They gathered around their ancient chief in the mountains, and Nana spoke words that have been preserved in Apache memory, passed down through generations. He said, "They think I am too old, too broken to fight. They think 8 warriors are nothing. We will teach them that Apache arithmetic counts differently." Apache arithmetic. I love that phrase. Because what he's saying is that the conventional mathematics of warfare, where more soldiers equals victory, doesn't apply when you change the variables. When you add in knowledge of terrain, speed of movement, psychological impact, and the willingness to take risks that conventional forces won't take. The campaign that followed remains the most successful guerrilla operation in North American military history, bar none. You can study revolutionary warfare, insurgencies, resistance movements across 2 continents and 3 centuries. Nothing matches what Nana accomplished in the next 75 days. Starting July 15, 1881, near Fort Apache, the 9 warriors exploded across New Mexico and Arizona like a thunderbolt. They struck the ranch of James Canby first, killed him and his companion, took their horses and ammunition, not randomly. Canby had good horses and a known ammunition stockpile. When pursuit arrived, the Apache had vanished into the Mogollon Mountains. Just gone, like they'd never existed. 3 days later, and 150 miles away, they attacked a wagon train near the San Simon Valley. 150 miles in 3 days while being pursued. They killed the drivers and disappeared with supplies meant for Fort Grant. The army couldn't understand it. How were they moving so fast? How were they appearing in places that should take a week to reach? The answer was simple but devastating. Nana was using captured cavalry horses, not just for speed, but for deception. Apache riding American military mounts could approach settlements without triggering immediate alarm. People saw cavalry horses and assumed American soldiers until the raiders were already in striking range. The army responded by deploying 1,400 soldiers. 1,400. The entire strength of the Department of New Mexico, plus reinforcements from Texas, against 8 warriors and their 81-year-old chief. Think about that resource allocation. The United States Army, fresh from conquering the Confederacy, couldn't spare these troops to deploy them across the Southwest chasing Nana. The economic cost alone was staggering. Every soldier in the field cost money, supplies, horses, weapons, telegraph communications, command structure, all deployed against 9 men. The 9th Cavalry's Buffalo soldiers took the lead in pursuit. These were African American troops, and the Apache respected them as the only American soldiers who fought with genuine skill. There was mutual respect between these forces. The Buffalo soldiers didn't underestimate Apache. They didn't assume superior numbers guaranteed victory. They fought smart, and still they couldn't catch Nana. At Gavilan Canyon, his warriors ambushed a 30-man cavalry patrol, 30 trained soldiers. The Apache killed 5 in 90 seconds and vanished. 90 seconds. Before the cavalry could organize a coherent response, the attackers were gone. Near Lake Valley mining camp, they appeared at dawn, seized 40 horses from the corral. 40 horses making noise, men shouting, guns firing, and they disappeared as 50 armed miners scrambled to respond. Witnesses swore they counted at least 25 Apache. 25. There were 8. Nana had taught his men to ride in patterns that multiplied their apparent numbers through dust and distance, psychological warfare amplifying combat effectiveness. The tactical innovations displayed during these 75 days revolutionized guerrilla warfare theory. Military academies still study this campaign. Nana used those captured cavalry horses not just for speed but to project false identity. He split his tiny force into pairs, attacking multiple locations simultaneously, making the army believe multiple bands were operating, spreading fear across a huge territory. Most brilliantly, he exploited jurisdictional boundaries between military districts. He would cross from New Mexico to Arizona precisely when pursuit required administrative coordination. One military department had to officially request assistance from another military department. Paperwork had to process. Authorizations had to arrive. By the time the bureaucracy caught up, Nana was 300 miles away, hitting targets in the district he'd just left. Near Sabinal, his warriors hit a stagecoach, killed the driver and guard, took the strongbox, but they also took the mailbags. The mail. Why? Because Nana wanted to know what was being communicated. His scouts could find Apache who read English to tell them what the letters said. Intelligence gathering from stolen correspondence. Near Chloride, they raided a mining camp, killed 3 guards, and disappeared with 40 mules. The mules were loaded with mining equipment worth thousands of dollars. Nana didn't want the equipment. He wanted the mules for transport and the economic disruption. Every mine shut down meant lost productivity, meant pressure on the army to stop the raids, meant more resources diverted to protection details. At Cuchillo Negro Creek, they fought their largest engagement. A detachment of buffalo soldiers cornered them in a canyon. Bad terrain for the Apache. The soldiers had the high ground. The conventional outcome was Apache annihilation. Instead, Nana's warriors laid down, suppressing fire, while 3 men scaled what the soldiers thought was an unclimbable cliff face. Got above the soldiers, started firing down into their position. The buffalo soldiers had to retreat. 3 Apache climbing a cliff changed the geometry of battle. The army reported 12 Apache in that fight. There were 8, always 8. By August, the telegraph wires were burning with desperate messages. Governors demanded protection. Mine owners threatened to shut down operations. Ranchers abandoned their property. The entire territorial economy was disrupting because 8 old men and their ancient chief were demonstrating that the Southwest wasn't actually pacified. That American control was an illusion sustained by Apache, choosing not to resist. When they chose to resist, when they applied their arithmetic to warfare, American military superiority evaporated. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. Towns that hadn't been attacked prepared for attack. Troops deployed to locations Nana had no intention of hitting. False reports multiplied the perceived size of his force. Some accounts claimed 50 Apache. Others said 100. The army knew it was 8. 8 warriors making 2 nations look incompetent. The humiliation burned worse than the casualties. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Apache were finished. Victoria was dead. The wars were over. Except Nana hadn't gotten the memo, or he'd gotten it and used it for kindling. By September, his warriors had traveled 3,000 miles. 3,000, fought 12 pitched battles, killed between 30 and 50 enemies. The numbers vary because some deaths weren't immediately reported and some wounded died later. They captured 340 horses and mules, disrupted mining operations worth millions in modern dollars, and they achieved all of this while never losing a single warrior. 2 were wounded, not dead, wounded. in 75 days of constant combat and pursuit. That's not luck. That's skill, planning, and leadership operating at levels the army couldn't match. On September 10th, they crossed into Mexico's Sierra Madre, where American forces couldn't follow. International boundary. Legal constraints. The soldiers could only watch as Nana's band rode into the mountains and disappeared. Behind them, they left a terrified territory and a humiliated army. General Eugene Carr reportedly threw his hat on the ground and stomped on it when informed of their escape. He was shouting profanity that cannot be repeated here. 1,400 soldiers, 3 months, unlimited resources. And 8 Apache warriors had beaten them all. The 10 years following his legendary raid saw Nana continue fighting alongside Geronimo, conducting smaller operations that kept 30% of America's combat forces tied down in the southwest. 30% of the entire army's combat strength, deployed against a few dozen Apache warriors. Even in his mid-80s, Nana led raids that younger warriors struggled to match. His body was failing. His foot dragged worse than ever. His hands shook from rheumatism, but his mind remained sharp as obsidian, calculating odds and exploiting weaknesses with the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades. American officers who finally met him during surrender negotiations in 1886 expressed shock. Genuine shock. This tiny, crippled ancient who needed help standing had outsmarted and outfought the entire American military establishment. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood wrote to his wife, and I'm going to quote this because it captures something essential. He said, "He looks like a grandfather who should be telling stories by the fire, yet his eyes hold a power that makes brave men step backward." That's from an American military officer, not an Apache legend, not tribal mythology. A trained observer describing the presence this man projected even in defeat, because it was defeat, finally, not military defeat. Nana never lost a battle he chose to fight, but demographic defeat, mathematical defeat. There simply weren't enough Apache left to continue. The last free bands surrendered not because they were conquered, but because they were exhausted, starving, and outnumbered to the point where survival meant accepting captivity. Nana spent his final decade imprisoned at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Imprisoned. Not as a prisoner of war with rights, but as a captive with none. He died there in 1896 at approximately 96 years old. The broken foot that defined his name outlasted empires. Yet confinement couldn't kill what he represented. He taught Apache children their language when government schools forbade it, whispering lessons when guards weren't listening. He kept the sacred knowledge alive in a place designed to destroy it. Young, Apache prisoners would gather around him, and he would close his eyes and recite the names of every spring, every sacred mountain, every secret trail in their homeland, a living map of a world they might never see but would never forget. That's resistance too, not combat resistance, cultural resistance, the refusal to let your people's knowledge die even when your people are dying. Military academies still study Nana's 1881 raid as perhaps the perfect example of asymmetric warfare. West Point, the War College, Special Forces training. They analyze his tactics, his intelligence gathering, his psychological warfare, the economic damage he inflicted, approximately $2 million in 1881 currency, cost the Apache nothing while forcing the American government to spend 20 times that amount in military response. $2 million in damage, $40 million in response costs, and that's just direct military expenditure. Add in lost mining productivity, abandoned ranches, disrupted commerce, and the number multiplies again. More importantly, he proved that will and wisdom could defeat overwhelming force, that 8 men who knew their land and themselves could humble an empire. Modern Special Forces doctrine, particularly the emphasis on small unit operations and psychological warfare, draws directly from lessons learned pursuing Nana across the Southwest. The idea that a small team of highly skilled operators can accomplish what conventional forces cannot. That's Nana's legacy in military terms. He wrote the textbook before the textbook existed. But his larger legacy lives in resistance movements worldwide. Every time an outmatched force refuses to accept inevitable defeat, Every time someone decides that dignity matters more than survival. Every time 8 people look at 1400 and say, Apache arithmetic counts differently. That's Nana. That's what he proved in the mountains of New Mexico and Arizona during 75 impossible days. Today, when Apache storytellers speak of Nana, they don't emphasize his deaths or captures, but his escapes and survival. They tell how 8 warriors made the mountains dance and the cavalry stumble. They remember that when America thought the Apache were finished, one ancient man with a broken foot proved that some spirits remain forever unconquered. The stories focus on his intelligence, his humor, his refusal to accept what everyone else considered inevitable. He becomes not a tragic figure, but a triumphant one, not because he won in any conventional sense, but because he never accepted the terms of defeat being offered. In the end, Nana won the only victory that truly mattered. He died undefeated in his own mind. The army never captured him in battle. He surrendered on his own terms when continuing meant only more death for his people. And his story continues to inspire resistance wherever the powerful assume the weak have no options left. That's immortality of a kind no conqueror achieves. The conquered remember their names with love. The conquerors get footnotes in military history. 8 warriors against an empire. 75 days that rewrote the rules of warfare. 1 broken foot that never stopped dancing. That's the story of Nana. And it's a story that refuses to end.